May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, may it please the court? Today, the prosecution has asked you to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. This case is not a question of what happened, but rather who did it. We are not disputing the fact that Lois May Alcott was murdered or that her home was burned down in an act of arson. We are merely disputing that Devin Emerson was the one who did it. The burden of evidence in this case lies on the prosecution to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Devin Emerson committed these crimes. As the defense, we do not have to prove that someone else did it, but merely that someone else could have done it. If there's any doubt as to whether or not Devin was the one who did it, you must find in favor of the defense. Despite the prosecution's attempts to exaggerate the certainty of this case, this is a case full of doubt. Before we discuss that which didn't happen, we must know what could have happened that day. We need to discuss those who actually had the means, motives, and the opportunity to kill Aunt May, unlike Devin Emerson. The first suspect is Sydney Alcott Walden. Sydney is a realtor who was working behind Aunt May's back to sell the property that May had legal control over. She took people on tours of the property and was even dealing with a Chicago investor, B.D. Weiss. The value of the house was in its land, not in the house itself, which would have been removed during construction anyway. Now, Sydney owned 25% of the Emerson property, and she had legal control of 50% more. Upon May's death, the amount that she owned went up to 50%, meaning that she would have owned half of the proceeds that came from the sale, in addition to the $1,500,000 commission that she would get from, $150,000 commission that she would get from the sale of this house. The value of the offer, of course, was over $5 million. And it was an offer that Mel Herman overheard Sydney describing on the phone as very generous on the very day of Aunt May's death. However, Aunt May refused to sell. Sydney and May fought about the deal on the day of Aunt May's death. In anger, Sydney left the property. When she returned to speak to May nearly 7:15, she supposedly never saw May. However, Mel was nearly hit by Sydney speeding out of the driveway with reckless abandon. Why was she going so fast? At the same time, long after the cookout, Mel Herman smelled something burning. The second suspect is B.D. Weiss, the big city developer that Sydney was working with. Weiss stood to benefit from Aunt May's death in the same way that Sydney had, and has a history of arson on his properties. If you look at Exhibit 10, the emails between Weiss and Devin, Weiss threatens Devin, who told Weiss to leave his family alone. Both Devin and Jalen reported that Devin had heard people moving around the property and suspected that she was not alone. It would have been easy for one of Weiss's associates to sneak onto the Emerson property. The prosecution's entire case rests on Devin's ability to sneak past Jalen to go and set the fire again. The third possibility is, of course, that Sydney and Weiss worked in conjunction to save their deal together. Now, the prosecution has put on a very good show today, and for that reason, we have to pull back the curtain on their version of the events. They claim that Devin killed Aunt May, seeking to repay her debts. However, although it may sound callous, Aunt May was worth far more monetarily to Devin alive than dead. She provided Devin with support as he figured out his life, and free rent, both worth far more than $1,600, which would have hardly helped Devin pay back $35,000 of debt. And despite Sydney's attempts to deny it, she was the one who explained to Devin that Devin would not immediately inherit the proceeds of the sale, a fact which Devin fully understood. The only person who profited off of Aunt May's death was Sydney herself, who stood to receive half of the proceeds of the deal. Sydney's greed, in this case, was the root of all problems. Jalen never saw Devin leave her house on the night of the murder, and Mel was not able to identify the person she saw leaving Aunt May's house. Immediately after Aunt May's death, Devin, in a state of shock, was unable to answer Hawthorne's questioning. Neither are the calls that Devin made in that state evidence. He was merely seeking to confront who he believed was responsible for Aunt May's death. After all, the call he made was made at 11:20. And Nat Hawthorne today testified that the 911 call was received at 10:48, not at 11:48, as the prosecution mistakenly stated. The biggest piece of evidence for Devin's innocence is his love of Aunt May. Aunt May was a mother to Devin, taking him in and raising him. She provided Devin a home, support, and love. She was a generous woman who Devin knew would try to help her if she knew about Devin's debts. And although Devin never troubled Aunt May about his debts, it is Aunt May's generous spirit that makes this, what happened to her, such a travesty. But it was not Devin who failed her, but the police, who despite being responsible for serving justice, offered instead a half-hearted, error-riddled investigation. Nat Hawthorne found one piece of evidence that implicated Devin, the money in his home, and stopped looking for other potential suspects. But they didn't find the money until the next day. Perhaps it was planted there during the time that elapsed between the fire and when the cops finally found it. Perhaps he did in fact steal it, but even if he did, it is not proof that he committed murder. The money itself is contaminated evidence. The police bagged it with the money that Jalen gave to Devin that same day, contaminating it with the lighter fluid that got on the money that Jalen gave Devin from the spill. The spill not only explains the accelerant on the money, but on Devin's shoes, as she stood in the spill. Nat Hawthorne relied heavily on shoe print analysis, an outdated and highly inaccurate form of evidence that served to prove nothing other than the fact that Devin was in fact on the property that she lived on at some point during that day. Even worse, Nat Hawthorne couldn't successfully complete this analysis because other unknown shoe prints were discarded before they could be tested. The police also failed to find key evidence until the following day. The accelerant was only found the next day in a very obvious location. Worst of all, there was no investigation of the man behind the curtain. There was no attempt to look at other suspects once they had decided that it was Devin who committed the murder. Hawthorne failed to unmask the person behind this crime. And so who is it? Who killed Aunt May? Who is the man behind the curtain? We don't know, and perhaps we never will. The blame for that falls squarely on Nat Hawthorne. You cannot find the suspect you never looked for. And you cannot convict an innocent man of murder, arson, and theft based solely on the money that a deeply flawed investigation found. The prosecution has not met their burden of proof in this case, failing to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Devin Emerson, is guilty of this heinous crime. The prosecution's theory is just that, a theory. For that reason, we ask that you find the defendant, Devin Emerson, not guilty on all charges.
How much time does the prosecution have for rebuttal?
2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Would you like to give a rebuttal on?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense's argument rests on the theory that there was an outside or third party responsible. As Jalen Whitman testified on direct, there was no way to get onto the Emerson property without Whitman being aware. There is no evidence that a third party was on the property that night. The footprints outside the Emerson house came from the cookout earlier that day. As for Sydney Alcott Walden, there may be motive, but there is no opportunity. She was not on the property when the fire began. She was not in need of money, so there was no reason to rob Lois May. Sydney Alcott Walden had been Lois May's best friend for years, and the night of the murder, she was only on the premises for approximately 10 minutes. Sydney herself told us that when she rang the doorbell, no one ever answered. Jalen Whitman, besides having absolutely no motive, is shown to be in a video chat session with his wife throughout the duration of the baseball game, ruling him out completely. Devin Emerson had motive. He had intent. He had opportunity. Beatty Weiss provided the financial solution to his problem, but it was Emerson who took the steps to reach it. It was Emerson who took the money, who burned the house, who killed Aunt May. Every person believes they are missing something. A heart, a brain, courage, a way to get back to Kansas. The Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain, may guide them on their way, but in the end, he was just that. A man who turned out to have no special powers, a man used to manipulating a city safely behind a curtain. It was the people actively trying to obtain a heart, a brain, courage, a way to go home, who found out it was in their power to return to Kansas the entire time. Beatty Weiss, the man behind the curtain, had no more power than Emerson gave him. When Emerson stole the money, when he killed her in cold blood, when he burned her house to the ground. Money is the root of all evil. It has poisoned this family tree, but we need not let it anymore. We can tear it up by the roots. And it is for these reasons that we ask you to find Devin Emerson guilty. Guilty of robbery in the first degree, arson in the second, and murder in the first.